In the heart of bustling London, where history blends with modern life, tourists gathered near Buckingham Palace for a glimpse of the world-famous Royal Guards. The guards stood like statues, their iconic red uniforms and tall black hats drawing admiration from visitors from all walks of life. Among the crowd that day was a woman whose presence would soon turn a peaceful afternoon into a whirlwind of controversy. Karen was her name, a middle-aged woman with an air of entitlement that clung to her like perfume. She strutted through the crowd with an exaggerated sense of purpose, her designer handbag swinging from her arm. Her sharp voice cut through the chatter as she complained about everything from the long lines to the inconsiderate tourists blocking her view. It didn't take long for her to draw the attention of others, though not for the reasons she might have hoped. Standing nearby was one of the royal guards, his dark skin contrasting beautifully against the bright red of his uniform. His presence was commanding, his posture unflinching despite the occasional jeers and antics of curious onlookers. The guard's discipline was evident. He didn't so much as blink at the antics of the crowd. But Karen's eyes zeroed in on him, and something about his calm demeanor seemed to ignite a fire in her. Why isn't he smiling? Don't they have manners? She muttered loudly enough for those around her to hear. A few tourists exchanged uncomfortable glances, their unease growing as Karen's comments turned sharper. I came all this way for a proper British experience, and this is what I get, she scoffed, shaking her head dramatically. The tension in the air was palpable, but Karen either didn't notice or didn't care. She began pushing her way closer to the guard, her voice growing louder with every step. "You there? Yes, you," she shouted, pointing a manicured finger at him. "Do you not understand basic courtesy? You're here to entertain us, not stand there like a lump." The crowd fell silent, the bustling atmosphere replaced by an uneasy stillness. All eyes were on the scene unfolding before them. The guard remained motionless, his face a picture of discipline. He had undoubtedly dealt with his fair share of difficult tourists, but something about Karen's brazen attitude felt different. It was as if she was determined to provoke a reaction, no matter what it took. Karen wasn't about to back down. Frustrated by his lack of response, she stepped even closer, invading the guard's personal space. Her words became more pointed, her tone dripping with condescension. "Oh, so you think you're better than us? Is that it? Just because you're in some fancy uniform," she sneered. "Don't forget, you're here because of us. We pay for this, you know." The crowd began murmuring among themselves, their discomfort growing by the second. A few brave souls trying to intervene, urging Karen to step back and leave the guard alone. But she brushed them off with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Mind your own business," she snapped. "I'll do what I please." What happened next left everyone in shock. Fueled by her growing frustration and a misguided sense of authority, Karen raised her hand and slapped the guard across the face. The sound echoed through the square, silencing even the whispers of the wind. Gasps erupted from the crowd as everyone froze, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. The guard didn't move, his face remaining stoic even after the blow. But something shifted in the air, a subtle change that sent a chill down the spines of those watching. Karen, emboldened by her actions, smirked as if she had won some unspoken battle. Then, in a move no one saw coming, the guard finally broke his silence. His deep, commanding voice cut through the tension like a knife. "You've gone too far," he said calmly, his words carrying a weight that made Karen's smirk falter. Before she could process what was happening, the guard took a single step forward, his towering presence suddenly feeling much more imposing. Karen's face went pale as the guard stepped forward. The air around him seemed heavier now, charged with a quiet authority that didn't need words to demand respect. The crowd watched, their breaths caught in their throats, unsure of what would happen next. Even Karen, in all her defiance, appeared momentarily taken aback. But she quickly recovered, her arrogance bubbling back to the surface. "What do you think you're doing?" she snapped, her voice shaky, but still loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'll have you fired for this. Do you even know who I am?" The guard didn't respond immediately. His dark eyes held hers, unwavering and steady, as if weighing every possible outcome. His silence was more unnerving than any words could have been, and Karen, for all her bravado, couldn't help but shift uncomfortably under his gaze. Meanwhile, the crowd had grown larger, with onlookers craning their necks to get a better view. Tourists whispered among themselves, phones held discreetly at their sides, unsure if recording the scene would escalate matters. A few murmurs of disapproval rippled through the gathering, though no one dared to step in. It was as though everyone sensed this moment was about more than just a tourist crossing the line. As Karen continued to rant, her words began to reveal more about who she was, or at least who she thought she was. "I've traveled all over the world," she declared, her voice rising with every sentence. "I've seen guards in Paris, Rome, even Tokyo. None of them acted as rudely as you. You're a disgrace to this country." Her tirade was relentless, but behind her words was an undercurrent of something deeper. It wasn't just anger or frustration. It was entitlement, a belief that she was above reproach. She seemed to relish the attention, even as the crowd's energy turned against her. But the guard remained calm, his posture unchanged despite her insults. His training was evident. He had likely faced countless situations like this before, though perhaps none quite as volatile. His silence, however, wasn't just discipline. It was a choice, a calculated decision to let Karen dig her own grave with every word she spoke. One of the bystanders, a young woman with a camera slung around her neck, leaned toward her friend and whispered, "She has no idea what she's getting herself into, does she?" Her friend shook his head, his expression a mix of disbelief and second-hand embarrassment. Karen, oblivious to the growing disdain around her, continued to press her luck. "You think you're so special, don't you?" she sneered. "Hiding behind that uniform, acting like you're better than everyone else. Well, newsflash, you're not." It was then that a man in the crowd, an older gentleman with a thick accent that hinted at years spent far from England, decided he couldn't stay silent any longer. "Madam, please," he said, his voice firm but polite. "You're embarrassing yourself." Karen whipped around to face him, her eyes narrowing. "And who asked you?" she snapped. "Mind your own business." The man raised his hands in a gesture of peace, but his eyes held a quiet disappointment. "Respect goes both ways," he said simply. His words lingered in the air, resonating with those who had been watching the scene unfold. But Karen wasn't one to be easily swayed. She turned back to the guard, doubling down on her efforts to provoke him. "Are you going to do something about this?" she demanded, gesturing toward the man who had spoken up. "Or are you just going to stand there like a useless statue?" The guard's expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something Karen didn't notice, but the crowd did. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it hinted at the fact that her actions were not going unnoticed. The tension in the square was almost unbearable now. It wasn't just about Karen's behavior or the guard's reaction anymore. It was about what this moment represented, the clash of arrogance against discipline, entitlement against respect. The crowd could feel it, even if they couldn't put it into words. And then, as if to add another layer to the unfolding drama, a young boy in the crowd asked his father, "Why is that lady yelling at the soldier?" His innocent question cut through the tension like a knife, and several people turned to look at him. The father knelt down, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "Sometimes people forget how to act when they're upset," he said gently. "But we should always treat others with kindness." The boy nodded, his eyes wide, as he looked back at the guard. He didn't understand the complexities of the situation, but he knew enough to sense that what Karen was doing wasn't right. As the minutes dragged on, the atmosphere grew heavier. The guard had yet to respond in any way that Karen deemed satisfactory, and her frustration was nearing its peak. But the crowd could sense that something was about to happen. It was in the way the guard held himself, the way his eyes stayed locked on Karen's even as she tried to assert her dominance. And then, in a voice that was calm, but carried the weight of authority, the guard finally spoke again. "You've said enough," he said, his words measured and deliberate. The crowd held its breath, the silence stretching out as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Karen's mouth opened as if to retort, but for once, no words came out. It was as though she had finally realized the gravity of the situation, though whether it was out of regret or fear was unclear. In that moment, it wasn't just about a slap or a string of insults. It was about the consequences of one's actions, about what happens when entitlement meets accountability. And though no one knew exactly how this story would end, one thing was certain: the lesson Karen was about to learn would be one she would never forget. The moment hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything unspoken. The guard's calm but firm words had clearly shaken Karen, though her pride wouldn't let her show it. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her cheeks flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. For the first time since her tirade began, she seemed unsure of her next move. The crowd, however, was anything but silent. While most people had been content to watch in uneasy fascination, murmurs of opinion were now starting to ripple through the gathered tourists. Some whispered about the guard's patience, admiring his restraint, while others expressed disbelief that Karen had taken things as far as she had. "He's handling it so well," one woman said quietly, clutching her camera to her chest. "I don't think I could stay that composed." A man standing nearby nodded. "She crossed the line the moment she touched him," he said, his tone a mix of disapproval and concern. What was she even thinking? But not everyone in the crowd shared the same sentiment. A small group of Karen's acquaintances, who had initially tried to keep their distance, now began to edge closer. One of them, a tall man in a tailored blazer, stepped forward cautiously. His face was flushed, either from embarrassment or the heat of the moment, and he cleared his throat awkwardly. "Karen, maybe we should go," he suggested, his voice low but urgent. "This isn't worth it." Karen whipped her head around, glaring at him with a ferocity that made him take a step back. "Go. Are you serious?" she snapped. "I'm not leaving until this man apologizes for his rudeness. Do you know how humiliating this is?" The man hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty to Karen and his own discomfort with the situation. "I just think we're drawing too much attention," he said carefully. "Let's not make this worse." Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Worse? He's the one who made this worse," she retorted, jabbing a finger in the guard's direction. All he had to do was show a little respect. But no, he had to act all high and mighty. The crowd's murmurs grew louder at this, a few people shaking their heads in disbelief. The young woman with the camera exchanged a glance with her friend, who muttered, "She really doesn't know when to stop, does she?" But as Karen's argument with her acquaintance continued, a new dynamic began to emerge. Some of the onlookers who had been hesitant to intervene now started stepping forward, their expressions a mix of frustration and determination. It was clear that Karen's behavior had struck a nerve, and people were no longer content to stand idly by. An older woman with silver hair and a kind face was the first to speak. "Excuse me, miss," she said gently but firmly, addressing Karen. "I don't think you understand the significance of these guards. They're not here to entertain us. They're serving their country." Karen turned to the woman, her eyes narrowing. "And who asked you?" she snapped. "This has nothing to do with you." The woman didn't flinch. "It has everything to do with respect," she replied calmly, "something you seem to have forgotten." A ripple of agreement ran through the crowd, emboldening others to speak up. A young man wearing a backpack raised his hand, as if he were in a classroom. "Yeah, she's right," he said. "These guys train for years to do what they do. You can't just walk up and—" He gestured vaguely toward the guard. "To that." Karen's cheeks grew redder as more voices joined in, their words blending into a chorus of disapproval. Her confidence was starting to falter, but she refused to back down. "You don't know the full story," she said defensively. "He was rude to me first." The crowd groaned collectively, clearly unimpressed by her attempt to shift blame. Even her acquaintances seemed uncomfortable now, their eyes darting between Karen and the growing number of dissenters. Meanwhile, the guard remained motionless, his expression unreadable. But those who had been paying close attention noticed something remarkable. Despite the chaos around him, he carried himself with unwavering dignity. It was a quiet strength, the kind that didn't need to be announced or proven. And in that moment, it became clear to many that his silence wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a testament to his character. But Karen wasn't finished. Desperation began to creep into her voice as she realized the tide was turning against her. "This is ridiculous," she said, throwing up her hands. "You're all ganging up on me like I'm some kind of villain. I was just standing up for myself." "Standing up for yourself doesn't mean putting someone else down," the older woman replied, her voice steady. "Maybe it's time to take a step back and think about what you're really upset about." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but found herself at a loss for words. For the first time, she looked genuinely unsure of herself, her eyes darting nervously between the guard and the crowd. It was as though the weight of the moment was finally beginning to sink in. And yet, the guard still hadn't moved. His silence spoke volumes, a stark contrast to Karen's noisy indignation. It was clear to everyone watching that he didn't need to defend himself. His presence alone was enough to command respect. But what no one could predict was how this confrontation would ultimately play out. The crowd was restless, the tension was palpable, and Karen's ego was still fighting for control. And though the guard remained composed, there was an undeniable sense that this story was far from over. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the square, the atmosphere grew even heavier. The tourists, who had initially gathered for a glimpse of tradition, were now witnessing something far more complex. A clash of values, a test of patience, and a lesson in humility. And though no one could say for certain what the outcome would be, one thing was clear. This was a moment no one would soon forget. The square felt like it was holding its breath. Karen stood there, her defiance slowly unraveling as the weight of the crowd's disapproval bore down on her. Yet, a stubborn glint in her eyes suggested she wasn't done. Her gaze flicked back to the guard, and something about his stoic calmness lit a new fire in her. She wasn't just angry anymore, she was desperate to prove she had the upper hand. "Is this how you treat people?" she snapped, her voice rising again. "You stand there, looking down on everyone like you're better than us. You're supposed to represent this country, and this is how you behave." Her words sounded hollow now, less convincing with every syllable. Even Karen seemed to sense it, but her pride wouldn't let her stop. The guard didn't flinch, didn't blink. His training had prepared him for moments like this, to remain steadfast in the face of provocation. But what Karen failed to realize was that his silence wasn't weakness. It wasn't indifference. It was control, discipline, and respect for the role he had sworn to uphold. And yet, Karen's arrogance wouldn't let her see it that way. To her, his lack of reaction was a challenge, one she was determined to win. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, a wave of quiet disapproval that seemed to surround Karen. A few people exchanged pointed glances, their frustration bubbling closer to the surface. Someone in the back muttered, "Why doesn't she just stop already?" Others nodded in agreement, their patience wearing thin. But Karen was too focused on the guard to notice. She stepped closer to him, her voice sharp and insistent. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" she said, practically hissing the words. "Well, you're not. You work for the public. For me, and I demand an apology." The crowd stirred uneasily. Her words had crossed yet another line, and the tension in the air felt almost unbearable. Even her acquaintances, who had been trying to blend into the background, looked visibly uncomfortable. One of them, the man in the blazer, tugged at Karen's arm. "Karen, let's just go," he said urgently. "This isn't worth it." Karen yanked her arm away, glaring at him. "No," she said firmly. "He needs to be held accountable." As she turned back to the guard, something in the crowd shifted. A young man stepped forward, his phone in hand. "You're the one who needs to be held accountable," he said, his voice steady but firm. "This isn't how you treat people." Karen's head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Who do you think you are?" I'm someone who respects people who do their jobs, the young man replied. You don't get to treat someone like this just because you're having a bad day. The crowd murmured in agreement, emboldened by his words. Another voice joined in, then another, until it became a chorus of quiet but firm opposition to Karen's behavior. For the first time, she seemed genuinely rattled. Her eyes darted around the square, taking in the faces of people who were no longer silent spectators, but active participants in calling out her actions. The energy in the square shifted again, this time toward a palpable anticipation. Karen's bravado was crumbling, but the guard remained unmoved, his composure unshaken. The crowd could sense that something was about to happen, though no one could say for sure what it would be. Karen's voice faltered as she tried to regain control of the situation. You don't understand, she said, her tone less confident now. He was being rude and... No, the older woman with silver hair interrupted, her voice calm but firm. You were being disrespectful, and now you're trying to justify it. Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Her confidence was wavering, but her pride wouldn't let her admit defeat. She turned back to the guard one last time, her eyes blazing. Say something, she demanded, her voice cracking. Do something. And then, in a moment that felt like the world itself had paused, the guard moved. It wasn't dramatic or confrontational. It was a single step forward, his boots clicking softly against the stone beneath him. But it was enough to make Karen stumble back, her confidence draining from her face like water from a broken dam. The crowd held its collective breath, their eyes locked on the guard. He didn't say a word, but his presence spoke volumes. It was a silent assertion of his dignity, his professionalism, and his refusal to stoop to Karen's level. The moment was electric, charged with a tension so thick it felt like it could snap at any second. Karen stood frozen, her face a mix of anger, fear, and something else. Realization. The crowd could see it, even if she couldn't admit it to herself. She had pushed too far, and now, for the first time, she was the one who felt small. But even as the tension reached its peak, the story wasn't over. The crowd was still watching, still waiting, still wondering how this would end. And though the guard remained silent, his unshakable resolve was louder than any words could have been. The square seemed to hold its breath, every person waiting for the moment when the conflict would finally reach its breaking point. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the scene, it was clear that the climax was drawing near. The crowd fell silent as the older man stepped forward, his calm but serious demeanor drawing everyone's attention. Karen, still rattled from the video's exposure, eyed him with suspicion. "And just who do you think you are?" she snapped, her voice sharp with desperation. She was grasping for control, but her confidence was slipping through her fingers like sand. The man ignored Karen's question and addressed the official instead. "My name is Mr. Rowland," he began, his voice steady. "I'm a retired military officer, and I served alongside some of the guards in this regiment years ago. I know the level of discipline and honor they'd bring to this role. That's why I felt compelled to speak up, because there's more going on here than meets the eye." The official regarded him curiously, clearly intrigued. "Go on," she said, folding her arms. Rowland glanced at the guard, who remained standing stoically, and then back at Karen. "I was watching from the side before things escalated," he said. This wasn't just about an overzealous tourist losing her temper. It was about someone trying to provoke a reaction, hoping to catch it on camera. The crowd murmured in confusion, and Karen stiffened, her expression darkening. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice tinged with panic. "That's absurd." But Roland didn't flinch. "I saw her fiddling with her phone before she approached the guard," he continued. And I noticed how her tone shifted the moment she started speaking to him. Louder, more exaggerated. It's the kind of behavior you see when someone's angling for attention, trying to make a scene. The official frowned, considering his words. Are you suggesting this was staged? Karen's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "That's a ridiculous accusation," she shouted. "You can't just make things up about me." But before anyone could respond, another voice rang out from the crowd. "He's right. A young woman stepped forward, holding up her phone. I've got footage of her setting up her camera before she walked over to the guard. She placed it on the ledge over there, probably to record the whole thing. All eyes turned to the young woman as she played the video for the official. Sure enough, it showed Karen positioning her phone at an angle that perfectly framed the guard before storming over to confront him. The crowd erupted into gasps and murmurs, the truth hitting them like a wave. Karen's jaw dropped as she floundered for an explanation. I wasn't doing anything wrong, she stammered. I just wanted a photo. That's all. But her protests fell on deaf ears. The crowd's patience had run out, and even the official's expression was one of stern disapproval. You orchestrated this entire incident, the official said, her voice cold and unwavering. You intentionally provoked the guards to create a spectacle, and then tried to paint yourself as the victim. Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The weight of her actions had finally caught up to her, and there was no escaping the truth. The official turned to the guard, her tone softening. You've handled this situation with exceptional professionalism, she said. Your composure is a credit to your training and to the role you fulfill. The guard nodded slightly, his expression unchanged, but the faintest glimmer of relief flickered in his eyes. The crowd broke into applause, their admiration for the guard clear and genuine. The young man who had recorded the confrontation smiled, his earlier frustration replaced with pride in standing up for what was right. Karen, on the other hand, stood frozen, her face a mix of anger, humiliation, and disbelief. But before the moment could settle, the older man, Rollins, spoke again, his tone carrying a note of irony. It's funny, he said, addressing Karen. You went to all this trouble to embarrass someone else, but in the end, you're the only one who ended up looking foolish. The crowd laughed softly, the tension in the square finally breaking. Karen looked around desperately, searching for an escape. Her so-called friends, who had remained silent throughout the ordeal, quietly slipped away, leaving her alone to face the consequences. The official stepped forward one last time, her expression resolute. Your behavior today wouldn't be ignored, she said firmly. The footage and witness accounts will be reviewed and appropriate action will be taken. For now, I suggest you leave before you cause any further disruption. Karen didn't argue. Her shoulders slumped as she turned and walked away, the weight of her actions finally setting on her. The crowd parted to let her pass, their silence more cutting than any words could have been. As the square returned to its usual hum of activity, the guard resumed his position, standing tall and dignified as ever. The crowd lingered for a while, exchanging stories and reflections on what they had witnessed. The older man, Roland, smiled softly to himself before blending back into the crowd, content that justice had been served in its own way. But just as it seemed the day had returned to normal, a faint buzz of curiosity rippled through the square. A group of tourists pointed toward the ledge where Karen had placed her phone, whispering excitedly. Someone retrieved the device, which had been left behind in her hasty retreat. The screen was still recording, capturing not only the confrontation, but also Karen's panicked departure. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Karen's attempt to create a viral moment had turned into something else entirely, a stark lesson in humility and the enduring power of integrity. As Karen disappeared into the distance, her shoulders hunched against the weight of her own actions, the atmosphere in the square shifted. The tension and discomfort she had brought melted away, replaced by a collective sense of relief and quiet satisfaction. People exchanged glances, murmurs of understanding passing between them. For all the drama they had witnessed, the outcome felt just and balanced. The guard remained steadfast, a testament to discipline and professionalism. His stoic presence had become more than just ceremonial that day. It had embodied the very principles of respect and restraint that many in the crowd now admired even more deeply. Parents nudged their children, quietly explaining the importance of the guard's role and the lesson they had all just learned about patience and integrity. The official, still holding the gravity of the situation in her expression, approached the young man who had been recording earlier. She extended a hand to him, her voice warm but measured. Thank you for your presence of mind, she said. Your video not only helped clarify the situation, but also ensured accountability. The young man smiled shyly, shaking her hand. "I just thought it was important to have the truth," he replied, "and I'm glad people could see it for what it was." Nearby, the older man, Mr. Rowland, leaned against a railing, watching the scene unfold with a quiet sense of accomplishment. He had stepped in not for attention or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. His years of experience had taught him that even small acts of intervention could change the course of events, and today had been no exception. The crowd gradually began to disperse, though many lingered, still buzzing with conversation. A group of tourists approached the guard to take photos, not with him, but of the area, ensuring they kept a respectful distance. It was as if the day's events had reminded everyone of the importance of treating these spaces and the people who served in them with dignity. Meanwhile, Karen's abandoned phone had become something of a curiosity. A passerby handed it to the official, who turned it over in her hands thoughtfully. The irony of Karen leaving behind the very device she had hoped to use to manipulate the narrative wasn't lost on her. "We'll make sure this gets returned to her," she said finally, her tone neutral but firm, along with a reminder of why honesty and respect matter. Roland chuckled softly. "Let's hope she reflects on today," he said. "It's not every day the truth wins out so decisively." As the afternoon wore on, the square returned to its usual rhythm. The guards completed their shifts, their disciplined movements drawing quiet admiration from the remaining spectators. The young woman who had provided the second video lingered for a while, chatting with others who had stayed. It was clear the experience had left an impression on her. "It's easy to get caught up in your own perspective," she said to someone beside her. "But today showed me how important it is to step back and see the bigger picture." Across the square, a small group of people stood under the shade of a tree, sharing their own takeaways from the incident. A middle-aged man, who had watched the entire event unfold, summed it up simply: "Respect goes both ways. That's what we've all seen here today." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden hue over the scene, the day's events felt like they had left an indelible mark. Not just on those directly involved, but on everyone who had watched. Conversations about integrity, respect, and the importance of standing up for what's right continued to ripple through the square, carried away like echoes on the breeze. For Karen, the lesson had been swift and public. Though she had left in a huff, it was impossible to imagine her brushing off what had happened. The footage, the crowd's reactions, the calm yet firm reprimand from the official. All of it had been a mirror, showing her a side of herself she couldn't ignore. Whether she would learn from it was anyone's guess, but the truth had been laid bare, and the opportunity for growth was hers to take. As for the guard, his day ended much like it had begun, with quiet dignity. But there was a subtle difference now, an unspoken bond between him and the crowd that had stood by him. Though his role demanded stoicism, there was no doubt that he had left an impression on everyone who had witnessed his restraint and professionalism. He had taught them all, in his own way, that strength isn't always about action. Sometimes it's about standing firm in the face of provocation. The older man, Roland, watched the sunset with a small, satisfied smile. He hadn't come to the square that day expecting to intervene in anything, but life had a way of presenting moments where doing the right thing mattered most. As he turned to leave, he caught the eye of the young man with the phone and gave him a nod. The young man nodded back, their unspoken understanding bridging the gap between generations. As the day drew to a close, the square stood as it always had, an enduring symbol of tradition and respect. But for those who had been there, it would forever hold the memory of a moment when truth and integrity had prevailed against selfishness and deceit. The guard remained, the sun setting behind him, a silent reminder of the values that had been tested and proven unshakable that day. And while Karen's story faded into the background, the lessons of the day lingered, etched into the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it. It was a reminder that respect, discipline, and honesty are not just ideals but actions, choices we make, even in the most unexpected moments. And sometimes those choices have the power to change everything.